Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Carlson, and I teach a class in the building inspection program. It's called Plan Review Software. This class essentially teaches students how to use a plan review software tool that's called Bluebeam. If you're familiar with Adobe Pro, Bluebeam is similar. It's a robust PDF markup tool that is used by about 95% of the contractors out there. This class uses Bluebeam's curriculum, and because I use this Bluebeam software every day in my day job as a building official for the city of Wilsonville, I get to bring real life examples of construction drawings into the class for students to work on in their labs. So the class is 2 credit hours. The first hour is lecture, followed by 3 hours of lab. So it's a fair bit of content. The class is divided into 12 modules. 9 of the modules have in-class exercises. This is where basically I lecture and then I demonstrate how to use a certain feature of the software using screen share. And the class then follows along. And then I give them a very similar exercise that they complete in class. They complete this using the tools and the processes that I just demonstrated in their example. Then they can ask me questions or they can ask their classmates questions at any time during the exercise. Once the lecture part is done, we then move into the lab time. So aside from me explaining the labs have very clear written instructions for the students to follow. This is more guided reinforcement of what they learned in their exercise using real life examples where they practice using the tools and the features of the software to mark up their PDF construction plans. I remain in the lab time and I remain in the lab for them to ask questions. So that's really kind of a quick overview of the class structure. Next, we move into the chart. So I'm going to go ahead and do a screen share here. And in this chart, we have this part one where it talks about the type of class that it is. Mine is a lecture lab, and it's 2 credit hours, 1 hour of lecture and 3 hours of lab. So that equates to about 6 hours of activity time per week for this particular class for the students. Under part two, I get into assignments, discussions, assessments, and then other activities. So I've outlined all of those. Um, I think, have 3 takeaways for this exercise. The first one was really kind of a gut check on the total number of segment hours versus planned activities. This was a healthy exercise for me because what I found was that I have a number of activities that don't fit neatly into each week. They're actually sort of spread out over the course of the term, and they happen ever so often. So what I found is that I needed to kind of break up the hours into minutes for the overall term, and that gave me a better handle on once I got the total minutes for the term. I could kind of identify where I had some gaps, and the total gap that I had was 190 minutes for the whole course. So that equates to about 19, 20 minutes or so for each lesson, each class. And so I feel pretty confident that I can easily make that up with either additional discussions, additional activities, plan review activities for the students. The second takeaway was really an affirmation of healthy, regular, and substantive interaction with students. I feel like this class really does that pretty well. It engages them at a healthy level. And then thirdly is really it made me kind of consider the whole equity lens, looking at this through the lens of equity and providing just a variety of ways for people to access the information. I always do provide a recording for students. That way they can access the information afterwards. They can play it back faster or slower. Um, use it to their heart's content. So those are really kind of the 3 takeaways. And then I guess we're supposed to kind of reflect on video, using video tools, and I do like using video tools. I use them a fair bit in some of my other classes that I teach at other institutions. I typically I have a YouTube channel, and I usually will make a video and send a link to students. One of my goals for this class is actually to make the introductory videos for each class. Haven't quite gotten around to that yet, so definitely plan on doing that. There you have it. Thanks for watching.